Why the flesh resists God, and how the Spirit must take control. Every believer, whether new to faith or seasoned by years of walking with God, eventually encounters a tension that feels deeply personal and unrelenting. It is the quiet yet fierce resistance that rises from within whenever obedience requires surrender, whenever truth demands change, and whenever God calls the heart to a higher way of living. This struggle is not merely external, nor is it caused only by circumstances, people, or temptations. It is an inner conflict, a war between two opposing forces living inside the same person, the flesh and the spirit. The flesh represents the old nature shaped by self-preservation, fear, pride, desire, and control. It seeks comfort over conviction, pleasure over purity, and safety over faith. The Spirit, on the other hand, is drawn toward God, truth, obedience, and eternal purpose. It longs for alignment with the will of God, even when that alignment requires sacrifice. These two forces do not coexist peacefully. When the Spirit awakens, the flesh feels threatened. When God draws closer, the flesh pushes back. This resistance is not accidental. It is the natural response of a nature that fears losing control. Many believers misunderstand this inner resistance. They assume something is wrong with them spiritually when they feel it. Others believe that spiritual maturity means the absence of struggle. In truth, the opposite is often the case. The presence of conflict is frequently a sign that the spirit is alive and pressing forward. The flesh does not fight what is already dead. It resists precisely because something within you is rising. This message exists to bring clarity to that hidden war. It is meant to expose why the flesh resists God so intensely, how that resistance manifests in daily life, and why the Spirit must ultimately take control if transformation is to occur. This is not a surface-level discussion. It is an invitation to understand the deeper mechanics of obedience, resistance, surrender, and spiritual authority. As you move through this teaching, you may recognize patterns within yourself that you have never fully named before. That recognition is not meant to condemn you, but to awaken you. The journey ahead is not about self-improvement or moral perfection. It is about spiritual alignment. It is about understanding why the flesh reacts the way it does and learning how to shift authority back to the spirit where it belongs. True freedom does not come from suppressing the flesh by sheer willpower, nor from indulging it under the excuse of weakness. Freedom comes when the spirit is strengthened enough to lead and the flesh is taught to follow. What follows is the first step in that journey. The nature of the flesh and why it fears God. The flesh is not merely the physical body, nor is it limited to obvious sinful behavior. It is a mindset, a governing orientation of the human will that seeks independence from God. At its core, the flesh desires autonomy. It wants to decide what is right, what is safe, what is pleasurable, and what is necessary. This desire for control is precisely why the flesh resists God. God's presence challenges autonomy. His truth exposes illusions. His authority demands surrender. From the moment a person begins to genuinely seek God, the flesh senses a threat. Not because God intends harm, but because surrender feels like loss to a nature that has survived by self-rule. The flesh has learned to protect itself through habits, emotional defenses, rationalizations, and patterns of behavior that provide a sense of control. When God begins to speak, he does not negotiate with those patterns. He invites transformation. That invitation feels dangerous to the flesh. One of the primary reasons the flesh resists God is fear of exposure. God's presence illuminates what has been hidden. Motives are revealed. Excuses lose their power. Self-deception becomes harder to maintain. The flesh thrives in shadows where behavior can be justified and intentions can remain ambiguous. When truth enters, the flesh feels naked and vulnerable. Rather than embrace healing, it often chooses resistance. Another reason the flesh resists God is its attachment to immediate gratification. The flesh lives in the now. It prioritizes comfort, pleasure, and emotional relief. The Spirit, however, operates with an eternal perspective. It is willing to endure discomfort for the sake of growth, discipline for the sake of freedom, and delay for the sake of obedience. This difference in perspective creates constant tension. Whenever God calls for patience, restraint, or sacrifice, the flesh reacts with frustration and protest. The flesh also resists God because obedience disrupts identity. Many people unknowingly build their sense of self around their coping mechanisms, desires, and emotional responses. When God begins to transform those patterns, it can feel like losing a part of oneself. The flesh interprets this as annihilation rather than renewal. It does not understand that what God removes is never the true self, but only what distorts it. Control is another central issue. The flesh equates control with safety. It believes that if it can manage outcomes, anticipate pain, and secure approval, it can avoid suffering. God's way, however, requires trust. Trust demands relinquishing control. This is deeply unsettling to the flesh. Faith feels like stepping into uncertainty. Obedience feels like vulnerability. The flesh responds by resisting, delaying, or redefining obedience to retain authority. The flesh is also reactive by nature. It responds to stimuli, emotions, and circumstances. When offended, it seeks defense or retaliation. When afraid, it seeks escape. When insecure, it seeks validation. God calls the Spirit to respond rather than react. He invites stillness where the flesh wants movement, silence where the flesh wants noise, and reflection where the flesh wants distraction. This contrast makes spiritual disciplines feel burdensome to the flesh, even though they are life-giving to the spirit. Importantly, the flesh resists God not only through obvious rebellion, but also through subtle compromise. It can appear religious while remaining unsubmitted. It can engage in spiritual language while avoiding transformation. It can perform rituals while resisting intimacy. This is one of the most deceptive forms of resistance because it allows the flesh to feel spiritual without surrendering authority. True spirituality, however, always leads to change. The flesh also resists God because it fears loss of identity rooted in comparison. Pride, envy, and insecurity are tools the flesh uses to establish worth. God dismantles these systems and replaces them with identity rooted in grace and truth. This transition feels destabilizing to the flesh. It would rather cling to familiar insecurities than trust an unfamiliar freedom. Understanding the nature of the flesh does not mean hating oneself or rejecting the body. It means recognizing which voice has been leading and which voice has been ignored. The flesh is not evil in its existence, but it becomes destructive when it governs. God does not seek to destroy the flesh. He seeks to place it under proper authority. The problem is not that the flesh exists, but that it has been ruling. When the spirit begins to awaken, the flesh often intensifies its resistance. Old habits resurface, doubts become louder, distractions multiply. This is not failure, it is exposure. The flesh fights hardest when it senses its dominance is being challenged. Many believers mistake this phase for regression, when in fact it is often the beginning of real transformation. The key is understanding that the flesh cannot be reasoned with into submission. It does not surrender through argument or self-effort. It yields only when the spirit is strengthened and consistently exercised. This strengthening does not happen overnight. It is cultivated through daily choices, intentional discipline, and continual surrender. As long as the flesh remains in control, the spiritual life will feel exhausting, inconsistent, and fragile. Obedience will feel forced, Peace will feel temporary, but when the Spirit begins to lead, something shifts. Resistance does not disappear, but it loses authority. Temptation does not vanish, but it loses dominance. The inner war becomes ordered rather than chaotic. This is why understanding the flesh is not optional for anyone seeking a genuine relationship with God. Without this awareness, believers either condemn themselves for struggling or excuse themselves from growth. Both responses keep the flesh in control. Awareness, however, creates choice. And choice is the doorway to freedom. The flesh resists God because God threatens its throne. The Spirit must take control not through aggression, but through alignment. This alignment begins with recognition, deepens through discipline, and matures through surrender. What you resist revealing to God is often what He most wants to heal. What the flesh fears losing is often what the Spirit needs to release. This inner war is not meant to destroy you. It is meant to refine you. And the very resistance you feel may be evidence that something within you is waking up. If this message resonates with you and you want to continue this journey of spiritual clarity and transformation, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this series, How the Flesh Maintains Control Through Habit, Emotion, and Fear. The flesh does not rule through sudden force. It rules through familiarity. Its greatest strength is not temptation itself, but repetition. Over time, repeated responses become habits. Habits become identity, and identity becomes authority. This is how the flesh quietly establishes control without ever announcing itself as an enemy. Most people do not wake up one day and choose to live led by the flesh. They drift into it through unexamined patterns, emotional reflexes, and fear-driven decisions that slowly shape their inner life. Habit is the first and most powerful tool the flesh uses to maintain dominance. Habits form when the same response is repeated in similar situations. When stress appears and the response is distraction, the flesh learns that avoidance works. When conflict arises and the response is withdrawal or aggression, the flesh learns how to protect itself. Over time, these responses feel automatic. They no longer appear as choices, but as instincts. The flesh thrives in this automatic state because anything that bypasses conscious awareness bypasses spiritual discernment. The Spirit operates through awareness and intention. The flesh operates through automation. This is why spiritual growth often feels slow at first. The Spirit must interrupt patterns that have been reinforced for years, sometimes decades. The flesh resists this interruption because it disrupts efficiency. It prefers predictable responses, even if they are destructive, over unfamiliar obedience that requires attention and effort. Emotion is the second mechanism through which the flesh exerts control. Emotions themselves are not the enemy. They are indicators, not dictators. However, when emotions become the primary decision-makers, the flesh gains leverage. Fear, anger, pleasure, shame, and desire can all be used to steer behavior without the involvement of truth. The flesh learns which emotions move you and presses those buttons repeatedly. Fear is particularly effective. Fear narrows focus. It reduces perspective. It convinces the mind that immediate relief is more important than long-term alignment. When fear dominates, the flesh offers quick solutions: escape, compromise, control, or numbing. The Spirit, however, often calls for stillness, trust, and endurance in the face of fear. This creates internal resistance. The flesh argues that obedience is risky, that surrender is unsafe, that faith is irresponsible. These arguments feel rational because fear makes them feel urgent. Shame is another emotional tool the flesh uses to maintain control. Shame convinces you that change is pointless because you are fundamentally flawed. It tells you that God's standards are unattainable and that failure is inevitable. When shame dominates, the flesh no longer needs to tempt you away from God. It simply convinces you that God is tired of you. This creates spiritual paralysis. The spirit longs to rise, but shame weighs it down. Pleasure is the opposite, but equally effective tool. The flesh trains the mind to associate certain behaviors with relief, comfort, or satisfaction. Over time, the absence of these pleasures feels like deprivation. The flesh exaggerates this sense of loss to discourage discipline. It whispers that life without indulgence will be empty, joyless, or oppressive. The spirit knows that true joy is deeper and more stable, but the flesh prefers intensity over depth. Emotional reasoning is one of the most subtle ways the flesh maintains control. Emotional reasoning occurs when feelings are treated as facts. I feel distant from God, so he must be distant. I feel unworthy, so I must be unworthy. I feel angry, so my anger must be justified. This form of reasoning bypasses truth and replaces it with internal sensation. The flesh thrives here because emotions fluctuate, but truth remains constant. When emotions lead, stability is impossible. Fear also reinforces control by shaping expectations. The flesh anticipates negative outcomes to discourage obedience. It imagines rejection, loss, discomfort, or failure. These imagined outcomes feel real enough to prevent action. The spirit calls for trust not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because obedience itself is the goal. The flesh cannot accept this. It demands certainty before surrender. God rarely offers certainty in advance. He offers presence instead. Another way the flesh maintains control is through identity attachment. The flesh binds habits and emotions to the sense of self. This is just how I am. I have always been this way. People expect this from me. These statements sound harmless, but they solidify patterns into identity. Once behavior becomes identity, change feels like self-betrayal. The flesh exploits this fear by framing transformation as loss rather than growth. The flesh also maintains control by exhausting the spirit. Constant stimulation, noise, busyness, and distraction weaken spiritual sensitivity. When the mind is never still, the spirit struggles to speak. The flesh prefers a crowded inner world where silence feels uncomfortable. In silence, truth surfaces. In stillness, conviction emerges. The flesh avoids both by keeping attention fragmented. Guilt can also be weaponized by the flesh. Unlike conviction, which leads to repentance and restoration, guilt leads to self-punishment and withdrawal. The flesh prefers guilt because it keeps the focus on the self rather than on God. A guilty person is often too occupied with self-condemnation to pursue transformation. The spirit calls for repentance, which restores connection. The flesh calls for guilt, which isolates. Fear of surrender is perhaps the deepest root of resistance. Surrender feels like vulnerability. It feels like stepping into the unknown without guarantees. The flesh equates vulnerability with danger because it has learned to survive through control. The spirit knows that true safety comes from alignment with God, not from self-protection. This difference in worldview creates constant tension. The flesh also resists through procrastination, disguised as wisdom. It says, not now, later, when things settle down, when I feel stronger. These delays feel reasonable, but they quietly preserve the status quo. The spirit calls for obedience in the present moment. The flesh defers to an imaginary future where obedience will be easier. That future rarely arrives. Another strategy of the flesh is selective obedience. It allows certain areas of life to be surrendered while guarding others fiercely. This creates the illusion of devotion without full submission. The flesh retains control over comfort zones while offering visible areas as evidence of faith. The spirit, however, seeks integration. Partial surrender always leads to internal conflict. Over time, these mechanisms create a system where the flesh feels like the default leader. The spirit feels like an occasional visitor rather than the governing authority. Prayer becomes reactive rather than relational. Scripture becomes informational rather than transformational. Faith becomes something practiced rather than lived. This is not because the spirit is weak by nature, but because it has been starved of consistent engagement. Breaking this pattern requires more than willpower. The flesh is skilled at outlasting short bursts of effort. What weakens it is sustained alignment, when truth is consistently chosen over emotion, when discipline becomes routine, when silence becomes familiar, the balance of power shifts. The flesh does not disappear, but it loses its dominance. Awareness is the first disruption. When you begin to notice patterns rather than identifying with them, authority begins to change. Choice re-enters the process. The spirit thrives on choice. Every moment of awareness is an opportunity for alignment. The flesh loses power when its tactics are exposed. This process can feel uncomfortable because it removes excuses. It removes the illusion of helplessness. It places responsibility back into the realm of choice. The flesh resists this because responsibility feels heavy. The spirit welcomes it because responsibility restores agency. Freedom does not come from eliminating emotion or habit, but from reordering them. Emotions become information rather than instruction. Habits become tools rather than masters. Fear becomes a signal rather than a ruler. This reordering is what it means for the spirit to take control. The flesh will always attempt to reclaim authority, especially during stress, fatigue, or uncertainty. This does not mean failure. It means vigilance is required. Spiritual leadership is not a one-time victory. It is a daily posture. Each day presents new opportunities for alignment. When the Spirit leads, life becomes quieter internally, even when circumstances are loud. Decisions become clearer, even when outcomes are uncertain. Peace becomes deeper, even when challenges persist. This peace does not come from control, but from trust. If you want to continue learning how to weaken the control of the flesh and strengthen the leadership of the Spirit, subscribe to the channel so you can continue this journey in the next part of this series. Why willpower is not enough, and how the Spirit gains authority. One of the greatest misconceptions in spiritual life is the belief that victory over the flesh comes through stronger willpower. Many sincere believers exhaust themselves trying harder, promising more, disciplining themselves with intensity, and restarting their commitment after every failure. When they fall again, they often conclude that they lack discipline, faith, or sincerity. This conclusion keeps them trapped in a cycle where the flesh quietly remains in control while the spirit is blamed for weakness. The truth is far more revealing and, paradoxically, far more hopeful. Willpower alone was never designed to rule the flesh. Authority belongs to the spirit, not to effort. Willpower is a function of the mind and emotions. It draws energy from motivation, urgency, and resolve. While useful in many areas of life, willpower is unstable by nature. It fluctuates with mood, fatigue, stress, and circumstances. The flesh understands this weakness very well. It waits patiently for willpower to fade. This is why so many resolutions collapse, not in moments of temptation, but in moments of exhaustion, discouragement, or emotional overload. The flesh does not need to defeat willpower directly. It simply needs to outlast it. The spirit operates on a completely different principle. It does not rely on emotional energy or mental strain. It functions through alignment, surrender, and authority. Authority does not argue with resistance. It overrides it. When the spirit leads, obedience flows from identity rather than effort. This is why people who walk deeply in the Spirit often appear calm, steady, and consistent. They are not constantly battling themselves internally. The battle has been reordered. The flesh loves willpower because willpower keeps the struggle internal and self-centered. As long as the believer believes that victory depends on personal strength, the flesh can remain unchallenged as the governing authority. The flesh does not mind effort, it minds surrender. Willpower never dethrones the flesh, only spiritual authority does. This is why repeated failure often leads to despair. The believer tries harder, fails again, and concludes that change is impossible. In reality, the strategy itself is flawed. The flesh is too deeply embedded to be overcome by bursts of determination. It has been reinforced through years of habit, emotional conditioning, and identity formation. Expecting willpower to undo that structure is like expecting a candle to overpower the sun. The issue is not effort but order. The Spirit gains authority not through force but through consent. Authority is always granted, not seized. The flesh has authority because it has been trusted to lead. This trust may not be conscious, but it is evident in whose voice is obeyed most consistently. Every time emotion overrides truth, the flesh is reinforced. Every time fear dictates action, the flesh is affirmed. Every time comfort is chosen over conviction, authority is reaffirmed. For the Spirit to gain authority, a transfer must occur. This transfer is not dramatic or instantaneous. It happens through repeated acts of surrender. Surrender is not passivity. It is an intentional yielding of decision-making power. It is the moment when a person says, not emotionally but structurally, I will no longer allow this impulse, fear, or desire to lead. This process feels unsettling because it removes familiar anchors. The flesh protests loudly during this transition. It exaggerates consequences, intensifies discomfort, and floods the mind with doubts. This reaction is often misinterpreted as spiritual attack or failure. In truth, it is a sign that authority is being challenged. Systems resist change. The flesh is no different. One of the reasons surrender feels so difficult is because it exposes the illusion of control. The flesh thrives on the belief that it knows how to keep you safe. The Spirit reveals that much of this safety is actually bondage. When surrender begins, the flesh interprets it as recklessness. It fears loss of identity, predictability, and self-definition. The Spirit sees surrender as alignment, not loss. Authority grows where trust is placed. When the believer consistently chooses truth over impulse, even in small ways, authority shifts incrementally. These small decisions matter far more than dramatic gestures. The flesh is not overthrown in a single moment of inspiration. It is displaced through daily, quiet obedience. Consistency, not intensity, is what strengthens the Spirit. Intensity exhausts. Consistency builds. This is why spiritual disciplines are effective not because they are difficult, but because they are repetitive. Prayer, silence, reflection, obedience, restraint. These practices are not tools of self-punishment. They are mechanisms of reordering. They slowly retrain the inner hierarchy. The flesh resists spiritual disciplines because they reduce its leverage. Silence removes distraction. Stillness exposes thought patterns. Reflection reveals motive. Obedience removes negotiation. Each discipline weakens a specific control point the flesh relies on. This is why discipline often feels uncomfortable at first. The discomfort is not evidence of harm, but of realignment. Another crucial truth is that authority grows through identity, not behavior modification. When obedience is pursued as a way to earn worth or approval, the flesh remains central. When obedience flows from identity, this is who I am becoming, the Spirit strengthens. Identity-based obedience is sustainable because it does not depend on constant self-monitoring. It becomes natural. The flesh resists identity transformation more than behavioral change. Behavior can be adjusted temporarily. Identity threatens permanence. This is why many people can change habits for a season, but revert under pressure. The underlying identity was never addressed. The Spirit reshapes identity by redefining value, purpose, and belonging. This takes time, repetition, and reinforcement. Fear plays a significant role here. The flesh fears that surrender will lead to loss, emptiness, or insignificance. The Spirit reveals that surrender leads to clarity, depth, and freedom. This difference cannot be fully understood intellectually. It must be experienced. This is why trust precedes understanding in spiritual growth. The flesh demands understanding before trust. The Spirit grows through trust that leads to understanding. Another reason willpower fails is because it often fights symptoms rather than roots. The flesh manifests through behaviors, but its roots are deeper: fear, insecurity, pride, and wounded identity. Willpower tries to suppress behavior without healing the source. The Spirit addresses the root by restoring alignment with truth. When roots change, behavior follows naturally. This process requires patience. The flesh thrives on urgency. It wants immediate relief or immediate results. The Spirit grows gradually, like a tree rather than a spark. Impatience often leads believers back to willpower strategies because they promise faster results. These results are usually shallow and temporary. The Spirit also gains authority through truth exposure. Truth disrupts deception. The flesh survives by distorting reality, exaggerating threats, minimizing consequences, rationalizing compromise. When truth is consistently brought into awareness, these distortions lose power. This is why reflection and honest self-examination are essential. They are not exercises in condemnation, but in clarity. Clarity is threatening to the flesh because it removes plausible deniability. Once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. Responsibility increases. The flesh prefers ambiguity. The Spirit prefers truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. Comfort is not the Spirit's primary goal. Alignment is. Another critical element in transferring authority is endurance. The flesh often escalates resistance when it realizes its control is weakening. Old temptations intensify. Emotional reactions become stronger. Doubts become more persuasive. This escalation is temporary, but it can feel overwhelming if misunderstood. Many people retreat at this stage, believing something is wrong. In reality, this is often the turning point. Endurance does not mean suppressing struggle. It means remaining aligned despite it. The flesh loses power when it fails to provoke reaction. When temptation is acknowledged but not obeyed, authority weakens. When emotion is felt but not followed blindly, authority shifts. The flesh feeds on reaction. The Spirit grows through response. Rest is also essential. The flesh often dominates when the body and mind are depleted. Fatigue lowers discernment. Overcommitment weakens resistance. The Spirit is not strengthened through constant strain, but through rhythm. Rest restores perspective. It allows the Spirit to regain clarity. Neglecting rest is often framed as devotion, but it can actually empower the flesh. Another important truth is that the Spirit does not need perfection to lead. Many people delay surrender because they believe they must first improve themselves. This is backward. Authority is not earned through performance. It is received through surrender. The Spirit leads best when acknowledged, not when proven. Grace plays a vital role here. Grace is not permission to remain unchanged. It is the power to change without condemnation. Condemnation strengthens the flesh by reinforcing shame and self-focus. Grace weakens the flesh by restoring connection and confidence. When failure is met with grace rather than despair, authority continues to shift toward the Spirit. Over time, something remarkable happens. The inner struggle does not disappear, but it becomes quieter. The flesh still speaks, but it no longer shouts. Its arguments feel less convincing. Its urgency loses force. Obedience begins to feel less like sacrifice and more like alignment. Peace becomes less dependent on circumstances. This transformation is not dramatic from the outside. It does not always produce visible success or approval, but internally, it changes everything. Life becomes less reactive. Decisions become less fear-driven. Faith becomes less exhausting. This is the fruit of spiritual authority. The spirit was never meant to compete with the flesh on the flesh's terms. It was meant to lead from a higher place. When that order is restored, the inner war does not vanish, but it becomes ordered. Chaos gives way to clarity. Resistance gives way to resolve. If you want to continue this journey of understanding how the spirit takes rightful authority and how lasting transformation actually occurs, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this series. The process of daily surrender and the quiet death of the flesh. The transfer of authority from the flesh to the spirit does not occur through a single decisive moment, no matter how sincere or emotional that moment may be. It occurs through a slow, often uncomfortable process known as daily surrender. This surrender is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with intensity or spiritual excitement. In fact, it often feels ordinary, repetitive, and unseen, yet it is precisely this quiet, consistent surrender that weakens the flesh more effectively than any emotional breakthrough ever could. The flesh does not die loudly. It dies quietly, through thousands of small refusals to obey its impulses. Many believers expect the flesh to be defeated through confrontation, discipline, or spiritual force, but the flesh is not dismantled by attack. It is dismantled by irrelevance. When the spirit consistently leads, the flesh loses influence, not because it is crushed, but because it is no longer consulted. Daily surrender begins with awareness, not awareness of sin alone, but awareness of inner movement. Thoughts, emotional reactions, impulses, and justifications must be noticed before they can be reordered. The flesh thrives in unconsciousness. It prefers to act without being questioned. When awareness increases, the flesh loses speed. What once felt automatic now requires permission. This is why the early stages of surrender often feel exhausting. Awareness slows everything down. Decisions that were once reflexive now require intention. The flesh interprets this slowdown as inefficiency and discomfort. It pushes for urgency. It wants quick reactions, fast relief, immediate resolution. The spirit invites pause. In the pause, truth has space to speak. The pause is one of the most threatening things to the flesh. In stillness, excuses weaken, rationalizations lose momentum. Emotional reactions lose intensity. The flesh prefers motion because motion hides motive. Stillness reveals it. This is why daily surrender often begins with learning to pause rather than react. Reaction is the flesh's language. Response is the spirit's language. Reaction happens before truth is consulted. Response happens after alignment is restored. Each time a person pauses before reacting, authority shifts slightly toward the spirit. This shift may feel insignificant in the moment, but it compounds over time. Surrender also involves redefining success. The flesh measures success by outcome, comfort achieved, pain avoided, control maintained. The spirit measures success by alignment, obedience chosen, truth honored, integrity preserved. This difference creates tension, especially when obedience appears to produce loss or discomfort. The flesh argues that surrender is failing. The spirit knows that surrender is victory. One of the most difficult aspects of daily surrender is letting go of emotional justification. The flesh often frames disobedience as understandable, reasonable, or necessary based on how something feels. Anyone would react this way. I deserve this. This is too much to ask. These justifications feel convincing because they are emotionally true, even when they are spiritually false. The spirit does not deny emotion, but it refuses to enthrone it. Emotion is acknowledged without being obeyed. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Suppressing emotion strengthens the flesh by driving it underground. Obeying emotion strengthens the flesh by giving it authority. Observing emotion without submission weakens the flesh by removing its leverage. Daily surrender also involves relinquishing the need to be right. The flesh clings tightly to self-justification. Being right provides a sense of power and protection. God often invites surrender in areas where the flesh feels most justified. This is not because God values submission over truth, but because self-righteousness blocks transformation. When the flesh insists on defending itself, learning stops. Humility creates space for growth. Humility is not self-rejection, it is self-honesty. It acknowledges limitation without despair. The flesh resists humility because humility dissolves hierarchy. It places God above self without negotiation. Another critical element of surrender is consistency during emotional neutrality. Many people pursue God passionately during crisis and neglect surrender during calm seasons. The flesh thrives in neutrality. When nothing feels urgent, it quietly reasserts control. Daily surrender means choosing alignment even when nothing feels wrong. This is why disciplines practiced in peace are more transformative than those practiced in desperation. Crisis-driven obedience often fades when relief comes. Identity-driven surrender endures because it is not tied to circumstance. The flesh resists this kind of surrender because it removes the excuse of necessity. Obedience becomes a way of life rather than a reaction. The flesh also resists surrender by demanding clarity before obedience. It wants full understanding, guaranteed outcomes, and emotional reassurance. The Spirit grows through trust, not explanation. God rarely explains before asking for obedience. He reveals understanding along the path, not before the step. This frustrates the flesh, which equates knowledge with control. Daily surrender often involves obeying without emotional confirmation. There are many moments when obedience feels dry, unrewarding, or unnoticed. The flesh interprets this as failure. The Spirit understands that faithfulness is not measured by feeling, but by consistency. Emotional reward is not the currency of spiritual authority. Another way the flesh resists surrender is through comparison. It measures progress against others to avoid internal examination. At least I am not like them. Others struggle more than I do. Comparison creates false comfort and prevents honest surrender. The Spirit does not compare, it aligns. Comparison also breeds discouragement. When the flesh sees others appearing more advanced, it uses shame to undermine perseverance. When it sees others struggling, it uses pride to justify stagnation. Both responses protect the flesh from surrender. True surrender is personal. It is not concerned with position, only with direction. The quiet death of the flesh also involves grieving what is released. The flesh is attached not only to sin, but to familiar versions of self. Letting go of old patterns can feel like losing a part of one's identity. This grief is often misunderstood and resisted. Many people rush to replace old behaviors without acknowledging the loss. This avoidance keeps the flesh alive through unresolved attachment. Grief, when allowed, becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. It honors what was without clinging to it. The Spirit does not rush grief. It allows mourning without retreat. The flesh wants immediate replacement. The Spirit allows space for transformation. Another critical aspect of daily surrender is obedience in unseen places. The flesh is motivated by recognition. It wants effort to be validated. God often works in secrecy because secrecy purifies motive. When obedience is unseen, it cannot be leveraged for identity or control. This deeply frustrates the flesh. Unseen obedience strengthens the Spirit more than public devotion ever could. It removes performance, it exposes intention, it reorders loyalty. Over time, obedience becomes less about proving faith and more about living it. The flesh also resists surrender by exploiting spiritual language. It can quote truth while avoiding obedience. It can agree intellectually while resisting practically. This creates a dangerous illusion of growth. Knowledge without surrender inflates the flesh, rather than weakening it. The Spirit values lived truth over spoken truth. Daily surrender requires returning again and again to simplicity. The flesh complicates, it negotiates, it rationalizes. The Spirit simplifies. It asks one question repeatedly: who is leading right now? This question cuts through confusion. It reveals authority. As surrender continues, something subtle but profound occurs. The inner noise begins to fade, not because life becomes easier, but because alignment increases. Decisions feel less fragmented. The constant inner debate loses intensity. Peace emerges not as an emotion, but as stability. The flesh does not disappear completely. It remains present but diminished. It still speaks, but with less credibility. Its arguments feel repetitive and predictable. The Spirit, now strengthened, recognizes these patterns quickly and responds without panic. This is the quiet death of the flesh. Not annihilation, but displacement. Not destruction, but dethronement. The flesh loses its seat at the center. It becomes a servant rather than a master. This process is not linear. There will be days of clarity and days of resistance. There will be moments of deep peace and moments of frustration. These fluctuations do not indicate failure. They indicate humanity. What matters is direction, not perfection. Daily surrender is not about becoming spiritually impressive. It is about becoming spiritually aligned. It is about choosing truth over impulse, response over reaction, trust over control again and again. Over time, these choices accumulate into transformation. The Spirit does not demand perfection to lead. It requires willingness. Each act of surrender strengthens its authority. Each refusal to react weakens the flesh. Each moment of trust deepens peace. If you want to continue learning how this daily surrender leads to lasting freedom and how the Spirit reshapes life from the inside out, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this series. Life when the Spirit leads, freedom, clarity, and the end of the inner war. When the Spirit finally takes its rightful place as the governing authority within a person, life does not suddenly become easy, painless, or free from challenge. What changes is not the absence of difficulty, but the absence of inner chaos. The greatest transformation is internal. The constant tension, the exhausting self-negotiation, the mental noise that once dominated every decision begins to lose its grip. Life becomes quieter on the inside, even when circumstances remain demanding on the outside. This is the true fruit of a Spirit-led life. One of the clearest signs that the Spirit is leading is the shift from compulsion to clarity. When the flesh ruled, decisions were often driven by urgency, fear, emotional pressure, or the need for relief. Choices felt reactive. Regret followed quickly, and peace was fragile. When the Spirit leads, decisions slow down, not because the person becomes indecisive, but because discernment replaces impulse. There is space between stimulus and response. In that space, wisdom operates. Clarity does not mean certainty about outcomes. It means confidence about direction. A Spirit-led person may not know exactly how things will unfold, but they know who is leading them. This removes the pressure to control results. The flesh demanded guarantees before obedience. The Spirit is content with guidance, one step at a time. This shift alone relieves an enormous burden. Freedom in a Spirit-led life is often misunderstood. It is not the freedom to do whatever one desires. It is the freedom from being ruled by desire. When the flesh governed, desire dictated behavior. Even when those desires were resisted, they still consumed energy. The Spirit-led life is free, not because desire disappears, but because desire loses authority. Temptation may still arise, but it no longer defines identity or direction. This freedom is deeply stabilizing. The person is no longer constantly pulled in multiple directions internally. Values align with actions, beliefs align with behavior. Integrity becomes natural rather than forced. This alignment creates peace that does not depend on mood, affirmation, or success. It is an internal coherence that remains even in adversity. Another hallmark of a spirit-led life is emotional regulation without suppression. Emotions are still felt fully, but they are no longer feared or obeyed blindly. Sadness does not become despair. Anger does not become destruction. Fear does not become paralysis. Each emotion is acknowledged, interpreted, and integrated rather than acted out impulsively. This maturity does not come from emotional detachment, but from spiritual grounding. The flesh once used emotions as leverage, pushing for immediate action. The spirit uses emotions as information. This change dramatically reduces inner conflict. Instead of fighting emotions or being controlled by them, the spirit-led person learns to walk through them. Emotional waves pass without capsizing the soul. Life under spiritual leadership also reshapes relationships. When the flesh ruled, relationships were often transactional, defensive, or dependent. Approval mattered too much. Rejection hurt too deeply. Boundaries were inconsistent. The spirit-led life brings healthier detachment without indifference. Love becomes less possessive. Forgiveness becomes more accessible. Conflict becomes less threatening. This does not mean relationships become perfect. It means they become less consuming. The spirit-led person no longer looks to others to validate identity or provide stability that only God can give. As a result, relationships are freed from impossible expectations. This freedom benefits everyone involved. Another profound shift occurs in how suffering is experienced. The flesh interprets suffering as failure, injustice, or abandonment. It demands immediate relief or explanation. The spirit understands suffering as part of formation. This does not make pain enjoyable, but it makes it meaningful. Meaning changes endurance. When suffering is interpreted through alignment rather than resistance, it loses its power to break the soul. A spirit-led person still grieves, still feels loss, still struggles. But suffering no longer dismantles identity. It no longer triggers panic or spiritual collapse. There is an underlying trust that remains intact. This trust is not naive optimism. It is rooted confidence that God is present even when understanding is absent. Another sign of spiritual leadership is the diminishing need to prove oneself. The flesh thrives on performance. It wants recognition, validation, and comparison. When the spirit leads, these motivations fade, not because ambition disappears, but because worth is no longer negotiated. Work becomes expression rather than compensation. Obedience becomes response rather than transaction. This internal security transforms motivation. The person no longer serves, gives, or obeys to earn love or avoid punishment. They do so because alignment feels right. This purity of motive brings deep rest. Exhaustion decreases not because effort stops, but because striving ends. A spirit-led life also brings increased sensitivity to truth. Conscience becomes clearer, discernment sharpens, deception feels uncomfortable more quickly. This sensitivity is not hypervigilance or judgmentalism, it is attunement. The spirit recognizes what aligns and what does not, without excessive analysis. This discernment protects without isolating. The person becomes harder to manipulate because fear and insecurity no longer dominate decisions. Boundaries become natural. Saying no becomes easier. Silence becomes more comfortable. The need to explain oneself constantly diminishes. Time is also experienced differently. The flesh is always rushing or avoiding. It lives either in anxiety about the future or regret about the past. The spirit anchors attention in the present. This presence brings peace, not because the present is always pleasant, but because it is real. The spirit does not live in imagined threats or rehearsed failures. As presence increases, gratitude deepens. Small things regain significance. Joy becomes quieter but more durable. The constant search for intensity fades. Contentment grows. This contentment is not complacency. It is satisfaction rooted in sufficiency rather than excess. The inner war does not disappear entirely, but it changes character. It becomes less of a battle and more of a vigilance. The flesh still attempts to reassert control, especially during fatigue, stress, or pain. But its voice is familiar now. It is recognized quickly. Authority has shifted. The spirit responds without panic. Failure, when it occurs, no longer leads to collapse. Shame loses its grip. Repentance becomes immediate rather than delayed. Recovery becomes faster. The flesh once used failure to reclaim authority through despair. The spirit uses failure as correction without condemnation. This resilience is one of the greatest fruits of a spirit-led life. The person becomes harder to derail, not because they are stronger by nature, but because they are anchored beyond themselves. Identity is no longer fragile. It is rooted. Another powerful change is the end of constant self-focus. When the flesh ruled, much energy was spent monitoring feelings, defending actions, managing image, and controlling perception. When the spirit leads, attention turns outward and upward, purpose expands, compassion deepens, service becomes less burdensome. This outward movement does not drain the person because it is no longer driven by need. It flows from abundance. The spirit-led life is marked by generosity of presence, patience, and understanding. This generosity is not forced. It emerges naturally from inner alignment. Over time, obedience becomes less conscious and more instinctive. What once required discipline becomes desire. What once felt restrictive feels protective. What once felt costly feels necessary. This transformation does not happen suddenly. It is the result of long faithfulness. The flesh once argued constantly. It negotiated, resisted, justified, and delayed. In a spirit-led life, that inner debate quiets. Not because the flesh has nothing to say, but because its authority is no longer recognized. Peace settles where conflict once dominated. This peace is not emotional numbness. It is stability. It remains during uncertainty. It holds during loss. It anchors during change. It is not dependent on outcomes. It is the byproduct of alignment. Life led by the Spirit is not a higher version of life led by the flesh. It is an entirely different orientation. The center has shifted. The throne has changed occupants. This is why the difference is so profound. The goal was never to eliminate struggle, but to end slavery. The flesh promised freedom but delivered bondage. The Spirit invites surrender but delivers freedom. This paradox is at the heart of spiritual transformation. The journey does not end here. Growth continues. Surrender deepens. Understanding expands. But the foundation is set. The inner war is no longer chaotic. Order has been restored. If you want to continue walking this path, deepening your understanding of spiritual authority, alignment, and freedom, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future teachings in this series.